It's amazing how many times I've run across check rides where they have like 50.5 hours of cross-country time. And I asked the question, so did you count the time that you did in your private with your instructor towards that? And they say, well, yeah. Well, but you weren't PIC on the initial cross countries you did that were dual until you did them solo, and we'll end up 2 or 3 hours short of that 50 PIC. So that's something just to kind of watch out for. It's a really quick gotcha, and just make sure you got that 50 that's actually PIC cross country time towards an instrument rating.
That's pilot examiner Jason Blair talking. In a moment, he'll be giving me a mock instrument check ride, which would help both pilots who are working on their instrument rating as well as pilots who already have a rating and would like to do some review. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. By the way, if you have any interest in buying a new or a used Cirrus SR-20, SR-22, or SF-50 Vision Jet, or you would like flight training in one, I talk with several listeners every week who call for advice on next steps and sometimes about the trade-offs of buying new versus used. And if you are thinking about a new airplane, definitely call me first. Call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 128, we talked with the people at Garmin responsible for their new Autoland system. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And just a quick note, if you haven't already, please click the subscribe button on your phone. Not only will that alert you when new shows are available from Aviation News Talk, but it will also boost our rankings, making it more likely that other people will find the show. Now here's our conversation with Jason Blair. Now let me tell you a little bit about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE or designated pilot examiner who gives check rides to pilots, and he's also an active flight instructor. He writes for both flying and plane and pilot magazines, and he's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he served on a number of industry committees. He's also one of our supporters who donates each month through Patreon to support the Aviation News Talk podcast. Jason, welcome back to the show. I think this is the fourth time you've been here. I'm thrilled to have you back.
It's an absolute pleasure to be back, and glad that you seem to think I still got good stuff to add for us. So I'll do my best to do exactly that again today.
Well, today I think we're going to have a little fun. Way back in episode 39, we talked about common problems that people have on check rides. And one of the problems is when they first get started, either the paperwork's not right or they haven't met the requirements in some ways. But today, let's talk about the instrument check ride. And this will also, I think, be helpful for people who are IFR pilots and just need to review all the rules and regulations. Let's pretend that you are giving me my check ride and we're going to do the oral portion. So, here I am, sir. What do we need to do to get started with the oral portion of my check ride today?
This is going to be a little bit fun. We get to test you a little bit and maybe even ask some trick questions that we see if we can give you stumpers that we wouldn't pass along to your average pilot.
All right. That'll be fun.
But, certainly fun to do. So.
And just to keep this, fair here, I have no resources open. There's no Google, no nothing. It's just me. So we'll see how I do here today.
Perfect. I love it. So, the hardest part a lot of times when we start a check ride is making sure somebody's not completely terrified, right? This is maybe the second check ride that somebody has taken when we do the instrument ride. They somehow survived that private ride without getting too scared. And I always tell applicants a little nervous is okay, but we try not to scare you. We know you're going to be nervous. I still get nervous when I do check rides and have done, tens of them around the years. And it's, you get to check ride day. We understand nervousness, but we try not to scare you too bad. But you come to your instrument one, hopefully you've survived that first one, and here we are. We're gonna start with the hard part for most of us, and that's the paperwork. We kind of mentioned that in a previous episode. We've talked about how the check ride might stop before it even starts, and paperwork really is something that it's part of the game. I kind of jokingly in my mind imagine there's a room full of monkeys that feed paperwork to all the good FAA folks down there in Oklahoma City, and if the monkeys don't feed the paperwork properly, which is basically IACRA feeding the stuff to them, right? Then we don't get to do the check ride. So they need to see the stuff from our end. That means we've done our job to actually qualify the person for that rating or certificate, in this case, the instrument rating. which means the examiner has to feed the right paperwork through the system. And we got to see that from the applicant too. And so we're going to need to see endorsements from the instructor, or we're going to need to see some logged ground training. This is something that's commonly missed. A lot of people log the flight time, but don't do such a good job at logging the actual ground training. And we need to see that you've got all the stuff into either IACRA or, in a rare case, the paper 8710 application. We're going to need to see a knowledge test has been completed. And sometimes the hardest part about all these is making sure the names match on all of them. It's a common problem. So, as you think about getting ready for your check ride, check those documents. Make sure your photo ID, whether it's passport or driver's license, whatever it happens to be, has the same name that's on your knowledge test, that has the same name that's on your pilot certificate, and has the same name on that application you're going to be submitting. If we do run into errors in those, maybe spell out the middle name on one but not on the other, it can actually be a hiccup for the check ride and not allow us to proceed forward. So getting that paperwork right is really a key part here. And it's also something that you can feel absolutely free to reach out to an examiner ahead of time for if you have a question. There's nothing wrong with calling the examiner. I always like to tell people, until I start asking questions, I can answer any question you want. I've had people in the last couple days for a couple commercial rides I've got coming up saying, hey, I've got some time questions. What if I did this solo, or if I did that with my instructor, does this count? I'd much rather check this stuff ahead of time. And the same goes for every instrument ride. If you've got a question about whether your flight times are going to meet the requirements, if you're missing an endorsement, reach out to the examiner and ask. They can certainly provide some reference back to you. And Max, if you're doing your check ride, man, I'm going to need to see all that paperwork squared up by your instructor. Or if we have a chance to fix it at a time, it means we might not have to hold the check ride up.
Well, and so what I'll often do is I'll just scan those endorsements ahead of time, email them to the examiner, because I'd much rather have you say, hey, you need to sign off on this one item here days before the check ride than scramble to do it during the check ride for a student.
For all those instructors listening, that's a great way to do it. I've even taken, text message pictures, whatever it happens to be. The more information you can give the examiner ahead of time, the easier it's going to be. And I will also add that in the last year or so, examiners have added a new system that we have to track Checkride. That's called the Designee Management System, which means we actually have to enter some information outside of IACRA in a completely different system ahead. So the sooner you can get us that IACRA application, maybe your FTN number, the easier it's going to be for us to make sure the paperwork's done ahead and we can find those errors. Shoot them pictures, email them, like you said, a text message, whatever happens to be. If you've got questions, check that ahead of time. So, I want to add a couple things here, just specifically for the instrument ride, a couple of the really big hiccups that we run into in qualifying an applicant. One of the requirements for a Part 61 instrument check ride is that they have 50 hours of PIC cross-country time. It's amazing how many times I've run across check rides where they have like 50.5 hours of cross-country time. And I ask the question, so did you count the time that you did in your private with your instructor towards that? And they say, well, yeah. Well, but you weren't PIC on the initial cross countries you did that were dual until you did them solo, and we'll end up 2 or 3 hours short of that 50 PIC. So that's something just to kind of watch out for. It's a really quick gotcha, and just make sure you got that 50 that's actually PIC cross-country time towards an instrument rating. It does help the examiner if you've kind of identified that time ahead and can help us find it. Make sure those cross-countries are all going to be to a place from which you started that goes more than 50 miles with a landing. That's part of the 61-1 definition. We'll run into check rides where somebody will show up and say, I flew these cross-country 38 times and I went 26 miles each time. And I go, oh man, we're not there. So make sure those cross-countries meet the requirements to get that 50 PIC. It's going to have to be more than 50 miles with a landing for the purposes of a rating or certificate. So the easier it is for us to find that on your check ride day, easier it's going to be for us to move past that point when you're qualifying for eligibility for the check ride. Along with that, you've got an IFR long cross country. It's got to have 3 different approaches at 3 different airports. One of those can be the airport you come back to, but it does also have to go, more than 250 total miles. It doesn't have to be 250 miles away, but it has to cover a distance of 250 miles. And they say by routing via airway. So it could be zigzagged a little bit, but the better you are able to designate and show us that requirement, the easier it's going to be for us to qualify you for that. Interestingly, as we think about modern training here, one of the easy ways to do that is, especially if you got an airplane that has ADS-B on it, jump on FlightAware and show us a track of the flight. Sometimes that's an easy way to show us, hey, here's my cross country and it met this, especially if the distances are going to be questionable whether you match the 250 miles. And then the last one, and this is one we've run into into a few times is make sure that CFI that you are using for the instrument training is a CF double I. 15 hours towards that instrument rating has to be with a double I. The rest could be with a safety pilot or a straight CFI, non-instrument rated instructor acting as a safety pilot for you. But I've seen a few cases where somebody has come and interestingly for me, it's been a case where I'm like, man, I remember giving your CFI a Checkride not long ago, and I don't think they're a double I yet. And I go back and look, and we find that time that they got doesn't always fully apply. So make sure that time's from an instrument instructor to meet that minimum 15 hours of training towards the instrument rating. Those are really some of the big hiccup points that we run into in terms of paperwork getting started for the Checkride.
Wow, I'm really shocked about the CFI who's not instrument rated giving instrument instruction. How does that happen?
Well, and it's, sometimes they don't treat it as instrument instruction. It's dual given, not instrument instruction. They treat it as safety pilot time in effect. And they can do that as a safety pilot, and somebody for an instrument rating can qualify some of their instrument experience while using a safety pilot, obviously in VFR conditions, but it does get a little bit mixed up in there when we're trying to do, instruction towards that particular rating here, the instrument rating. So Max, we're going to get past your paperwork, right? This is going to be the easy part for you because your instructor is going to have it all set up. You're going to have done your logbook, and we're going to dive into a briefing. I think in previous podcasts, we've kind of talked about the structure, how you're going to get a briefing before we go through the flight portion. And then we're going to dive into the ground once we're all set and moving on. And then we're going to dive into a flight portion after that, assuming you do well on your ground portion. And eventually we'll give you hopefully a new rating on that certificate at the end of it, right? So there's kind of the process.
Well, and I think I'm prepared because I had an awesome instructor. And most importantly, I got a good night's sleep last night. I didn't, stay up all night thinking, oh gosh, I have a check ride tomorrow.
Even better, and you know what? It's even better if your examiner has a little bit of coffee in the morning, and we're prepped for it too. We got to prepare for this, and I actually have in front of me right now what I call a plan of action, or actually what the FAA calls a plan of action. It's basically what an examiner creates to make sure we're giving you a full, complete check ride that meets those airman certification standards, right? Okay. For any applicant who doesn't know what those are, maybe it's time to postpone that check ride and go back and do a little check-in. That airman certification standards is what we use for every check ride, except for a couple of them that still have practical test standards. It's the examiner's menu for the check ride, right?
Yep.
So you have a pretty good idea what we're all going to ask.
Yeah.
Right?
I was going to say it would be crazy for someone to go to their check ride without having read through the ACS ahead of time, because otherwise you're going to get surprised. You're going to get asked stuff that you had no idea you were going to get asked.
I wholeheartedly agree, and make sure you bring something maybe a little more current than that 2017 FAR aim with you too, right? So resources, this is a practical test. You can have resources. Now, Max, you did mention a little while ago as we're doing the podcast here, you have no resources in front of you. So maybe we'll hold you to a little different standard for the moment. So let's talk about the ground portion a little bit. For an instrument check ride, we have a few things that are required that we're going to cover. And I'm just going to kind of broadly cover some of these, and maybe we'll poke at it a little bit for you. So a couple of things we have to make sure as an examiner that you can do is make sure the aircraft is qualified to fly in, regular in general, and then also instrument conditions. We have to make sure you as the pilot know if you're going to be qualified and able to fly in certainly regulatory compliance in general, and also for the specific instrument conditions. We're going to talk about the aircraft systems, and typically the examiner is going to focus on the systems that are in the aircraft that you are going to be using on the practical test. This is one of the reasons the examiner is going to ask, hey, what kind of airplane are you using when they schedule your practical test or that check ride? A lot of times we'll ask also if we don't, already know if it's not an airplane we're familiar with in terms of the particular aircraft, hey, what you got in the panel in that thing? So we can kind of tailor the systems questions and the planning we're going to ask based on the systems. If you're showing up with a 1972 172 with round gauges, maybe a Garmin 430, our questions might be a little bit different than if you say I'm bringing that nice new 2018 SR22. We're going to have a nice glass panel, and we're going to ask some different questions and ask some different systems information in that. One of the things we have to ask is systems failures. What happens if different things are not working properly? And that's part of your check ride too. So we're going to dive through some systems at some point. It may be incorporated into scenarios on the test. All of our tests are really focused on scenario-based testing. So we're going to try and make this applicable to real world. So Max, I probably would have given you ahead of time a situation where I might say, hey, it's Thursday, we're going to meet for the Checkride, and the purpose for today's flight, we'll simulate that maybe we were going to, take a flight over to, I don't know, where do we want to go here? Maybe take a ride out to Custer County in North Dakota. Imagine we're out there and go check out Mount Rushmore for the first snow of the year that I think they got recently here. So, we'll give you a reason to go somewhere, and maybe even a pressure moment of, well, geez, we got to be there by 4:00 because we got a dinner that we're meeting some friends at. And so how are you gonna make sure we get there in time, and where are we going to be leaving from, and tell me how we're going to get there. And that's kind of the scenario. Now, your job as the applicant is really to come prepared to that practical test with some considerations of how you're going to get there, what your routing might look like, what kind of charting you're going to plan using, whether that's digital or paper charts, how you're going to find information about the flight in terms of weather, maybe NOTAMs, many changes to procedures. Sometimes we'll even, as examiners, pick places where we know there's some NOTAMs, or maybe we know there's some weather that would be something you would consider, and you get to apply that scenario. And this is how we get to ask questions about other things like, how do you do your planning? How do you determine what the weather is going to be? How do you determine if the approaches at the airport are applicable for the aircraft you're going to be using? As a part of that scenario, we get to dive into the approaches then too, and we're going to probably look at things like alternate minimums and that kind of stuff too. Is that making sense for kind of what we're looking at on the ground portion for you so far?
Yeah, so it sounds to me like after we've gone through the qualification process and we've seen that, yes, I have all the things I need in my logbook, and you've looked at my aircraft documents, and you've looked at my personal documents, that now you're going to look at that flight plan that I prepared, because a few days prior to the flight, you told me to prepare a flight plan to Foster County, South Dakota. So if I'm really savvy, I probably would have reviewed that with my flight instructor before I showed up with you, though not necessarily. And I guess I would have looked at routing to get from here to there and proposed a particular route. I would have looked at my approaches there, looked at NOTAMs, and try and make sure that none of them are, affect particular approaches. In other words, there aren't approaches that I don't want to use because maybe they're not available at night or, something like that. Certainly I'd be looking at which approaches have the lowest minimums, because it's wintertime. We might have some poor weather. And then I guess I'm looking at weather, and I'm going to care a lot about things like freezing levels and icing and things like that we don't usually care nearly as much about as a private pilot because we're not in the clouds.
This is a great way to start thinking about it. I think you're right on track. So let's start picking through some of these things. I might start my Checkride with some really basic things. You're going to have brought an airplane to us, and I'm going to say, all right, Max, I see you brought, I don't know, what kind of airplane you want to be flying today for your Checkride?
I would say let's bring a 172 G1000. A lot of folks are out there doing those. So
all right, so we got a 172 G1000, and I'll say, I see you've got some logbooks. One of the things we have to do as an examiner is make sure we are flying in an airplane that's legal. And if I've never flown with you before and you showed up with an airplane I've never physically been in before, or maybe it's been a little while, I need you to show me that the airplane is qualified and legal and has all its inspections. So that's one of the things a lot of times I'll start with. Say, all right, what do I need to find for inspections in the aircraft logbooks to make sure that I can legally fly it today? And we're thinking basic VFR, but then also what are the IFR required inspections that you're going to tell me we need to find down here?
Okay, well, let's see. So I'm going to open up the logbooks here, and I'm going to show you that we've got an annual inspection. And if I have 3 different logbooks, propeller, engine, and airframe, I'll show you all 3 of those annuals. Maybe this aircraft is not mine. I've rented it, so I'll probably show you a 100-hour inspection because it's for hire. Let's see what else. I'm going to need a transponder inspection done in the last 24 calendar months. But since this is an IFR Checkride, in addition to that, I've got to show you the pedostatic inspection, which probably was done at the same time as the transponder inspection. I'm going to show you the ELT inspection, which has to be done every year. And of course, there are requirements for the ELT battery. Can't have expired, or can't be used more than an hour cumulatively, or can't have been used more than 50% the capacity of the battery. And then I think I'm down to the ADs. And for a Cessna 172 G1000, we're going to have fewer ADs than the older Cessna, so I don't think we've got the seat rail AD anymore, but we've probably got one regarding the fuel lines or fuel something or another.
May have one for the fuel lines. Every once in a while, we'll find one for ignition switches, depending on the Bendix that's on them, things like that. But yeah, you're right on track. And certainly if you have an older airplane, the 172 especially is a common one that we find missed, is that seat rail track AD, especially for owners' airplanes. If they fly them more than 100 hours a year, that 100-hour seat rail track gets done most commonly for rented aircraft. But if you happen to own the airplane, it is one that gets missed. So
isn't that every 25 hours? I seem to recall it's really frequent.
Yeah, with the older 172s, it's actually fairly common to find a lot of times a 100-hour inspection. And if it's an owner that owns the airplane, that's one that does get missed. And interestingly enough, it would actually stop us from being able to continue the check ride. So even on an instrument check ride here, just making sure all those ADs and inspections are completed, it's a great testing item, but it's also something that is all allowing us to qualify the aircraft as able to be flown for the examiner. So, Max, you're doing a pretty good job on those questions. So,
well, I know these are the softball questions. So
these are the softball, right?
Exactly.
This is the warm-up. So,
exactly.
Then this is something that's really good to review ahead of time. It can take literally just a few minutes during the check ride if you're ahead of the game and you've seen the logbooks ahead of time. This is something that spend a little bit of time, and it should be a nice, easy one for us. But then we start to make it a little bit more interesting, and we might ask something like, "Hey, Max, I noticed that our G1000 airplane has 2 alternators on it. What if I came out and I did my pre-flight and I noticed in my run-up that the alternator 2 wasn't charging? Could I still go flying?"
Well, let me think about that. In my Cessna 172 G1000, I've got 2 batteries, but I think I've got 1 alternator, as I recall.
Okay.
So let's make it a Cirrus, where I do have 2 alternators. What I would do in my Cirrus that I have brought to the check ride is I would pull out my POH. I'd go into Section 2 limitations, and I would look at the KOE table, the kinds of operation equipment list, and I'd see if an alternator 2 was required for IFR flight. And I think the answer is it is. Wouldn't be required for VFR flight, but would be required for IFR.
Cool. And this is the exact process that I'm looking for you to do. It does a couple things as an examiner. One, shows me you know your systems, because we're able to understand, do we have 1 alternator, 2 alternators, 1 battery, 2 batteries? And then we're able to try and determine in a failure of a system, how do we determine if we can still fly? And what you might find, especially in that Cirrus, is you might have to say, geez, I can't fly IFR, but I might be able to fly myself home VFR under the kinds of operation list. If I got an older airplane or an airplane that does not have a kinds of operation list or doesn't have an FAA-approved minimum equipment list, it pretty much means everything's got to be working, or I'm going to need one of those special flight permits. And it's as simple as that for your answer. If you tell me, hey, I don't have one of these lists, I need to get it fixed, or I need to get a ferry permit to get it home, or a special flight permit. So it's allowing me to help determine whether or not you understand the limitations of the aircraft and the systems.
Okay.
So we also got to qualify the pilot, right? And we kind of assume when you come to an instrument rating that you remember how to keep yourself VFR current. You need a flight review and the takeoffs and landings, but we do need to know that you can make sure you are current for IFR conditions as well. So, I'll start with the basics. Max, what do you need to do to be current to fly in non-VFR, in these instrument conditions, which is really the point of the check ride, right? We're trying to make sure, can you fly in instrument conditions? So what do you need to do from a basic currency standpoint?
Okay, so you're asking me essentially a VFR question here, and then you'll get me to the IFR portion of it.
Yes.
To fly VFR, let's see, I'm going to assume I'm not taking any passengers. We'll make it easy.
Okay.
I have to have had a flight review within the past 2 years, or I have to have, gotten a new rating in the past 2 years, or participated in the WINGS program in the past 2 years. And let's see, I need a pilot certificate. I need a medical, which is still valid, at least a 3rd class medical done in at least the last 2 years at my age. And I've got to have my photo ID. Now, if I were taking passengers and it's daytime, I'd need 3 takeoffs and landings within the past 90 days, and those could be touch and goes if it's daytime. They'd have to be to a full stop if it were nighttime.
Perfect. So let's imagine we have all of those things done, but now we look outside and it's maybe 802 miles viz, 800 overcast, and we're thinking, boy, it's a good thing I got this instrument rating. What are you going to have to do from an instrument currency standpoint to be able to fly, when it's lower than VFR conditions?
Well, I have to have all the other stuff that I just talked about. And in addition to that, if my check ride was more than 6 months ago, I'd have to look back into my logbook and I'd have to see in the prior 6 months, not this month, but the 6 preceding months, whether I had 6 instrument approaches where I was at least in the clouds, some of the time down toward minimums. And I'd have to see if I had at least one hold logged. And I would also have to have tracked navigational courses or VOR airways or something like that.
Sure, you're right on the right track here. And then I'll ask a question. A lot of times it really kind of mixes people up and say, well, what if I've been flying in instrument conditions and I just shot the same ILS 6 times on the way home? Does that count? Or do I have to mix it up?
In this particular case, no. You could do the same ILS. You could do them one a month. And if you did that forever and your hold every 6 months, you should be good.
You're absolutely on the right track here. And it's pretty simple what it says. It says fly 6 approaches in the preceding months, right? It doesn't say anything more detailed than that. So, but then we'll start to say, all right, well, what if I had a little gap in my flying? It's been really nice weather, haven't shot some approaches. And what if I did not have the ability to find in my logbook 6 approaches that were within those preceding 6 months? So how do I get myself back current again?
Well, let's see. I have 6 months where I need to then go out with a safety pilot or a flight instructor. And in those 6 months, I've got to achieve essentially the same thing. I've got to do 6 more instrument approaches under the hood, and I won't be able to do those in IMC. In other words, I can't file a flight plan at this point. And so I'm going to have to stay pretty much VFR unless I happen to have a flight instructor who's a double I with me. And if in those next 6 months I can accomplish that, then I'm current again.
And you're right on track there again. So one of the catch points that we find a lot of people have a question on is, you said we can fly with a double I, right? And I agree, as long as that double I is current also. One of the questions I'll ask is, well, what if you found a safety pilot who was an instrument pilot and they were current? Could you go fly and do in actual IMC currency flying as long as they filed the flight plan?
Good question.
Good question, isn't it?
I mean, for sure, they would have to file the flight plan. It would have to be in their name. And now I just have to ask myself, could I be legally flying the airplane? I'm not sure.
And this is where the question, if we drill down a little bit and say, all right, so if you are going to get current, you have to be PIC, right?
Yes.
Can you be PIC when you're not current?
Well, so I can log PIC time, but I can't be PIC. So in other words, I can log PIC time by being the sole manipulator of the controls. I could log PIC time, but no, I wouldn't be PIC. So I guess that wouldn't get me current.
And that's the best way. It's a great experience. Get your friend current if you took them flying like that, but it doesn't allow you to log that time. So as we think our way through this, and this is one of the confusing points, a lot of people mix up and say, well, okay, so I have my first 6 months and then I have my second 6 months. So as long as I stay current within a year, I'm still current, right? Or when do I actually fall completely out of currency and need to do something other than just flying approaches? How would we apply that, Max?
Well, let's see. I don't have 6 approaches in the preceding 6 months, and then another 6 months went by, and that was my period to try and get current back in VFR conditions with a safety pilot, and that went by. So now a year has gone by, and I'm required to take an instrument proficiency check with a CFII, and in that they're going to make me do substantially all of what I have to do for the flight portion of a instrument check ride.
So, and how would you figure out what exactly is on that IPC, that instrument proficiency check?
I would go to the ACS for the instrument check ride, and buried in there is going to be a little table which is going to tell me which of the items on the check ride I have to do for an IPC. And I think it's about 80% of them. It's most of them.
It is most of them, and it's actually kind of skipping the ground portion, and it is the flight portion basically going to do what you'll do on a check ride on the flight portion. It's a precision, a non-precision approach, and typically a non-precision approach with a simulated failure, a partial panel, we'll call it. It's actually the exact same thing. So the difference there is you have specific items you have to do on an IPC, whereas if you just stay current, you can shoot the same approach multiple times over and over. Interestingly, it's not always a year that's going to get you, though, Max. It could be 6 months of non-currency, right?
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. So in other words, I might not get the full year. I might have to do it right after 6 months.
Yep. So the way the regulation reads is if you are not current for more than 6 months, then you need that IPC. So it's a little bit confusing for people sometimes, but a lot of times what I'll do is literally stand on the whiteboard and write the months out, January, February, March, and I'll say, you did 2 approaches this month, 4 this one that month, and have somebody be able to apply when they'll no longer be current. And that's what we're looking for. Can you figure out how to make sure you are going to stay compliant as an instrument pilot? And we're asking that on your Checkride.
Okay. Good.
So we've kind of qualified the airplane. We've kind of qualified you. We're figuring out the basics here. A lot of times we're going to dig into systems from this point and talk about the airplane itself. So Max, you said we're using a G1000, Cessna 172. And one of the fun questions I'll ask, especially if somebody did their training in other airplanes, is, does this airplane have a vacuum system?
Yes, it's a 172. It will have a vacuum system.
Yeah, and sometimes they won't, right? If we got in a new Cirrus or a new Diamond, something like that, they may not have one. Even if we trained in something that had a round gauge, we want to try and figure out, maybe we have a round gauge backup instrument. Sometimes I've jumped in some Piper aircraft that the backup is an Aspen. There may not even be a vacuum system or vacuum pump on the aircraft. So knowing what systems are specifically on the airplane is really kind of an important piece. We hinted at the alternator battery systems a little bit ago. I'd like to dig into this a little bit. So Max, you said we have one alternator but 2 batteries on this airplane, right? So in the G1000 172s, if we had an alternator failure, we'll ask a question like, how would you even know it happened? Let's start with the basics.
Well, so in the G1000 airplane, we've got better notification systems than we would have in a round gauge airplane. In an older round gauge airplane, if we have an alternator failure, our only clue might be a little tiny red light down by our knee out of our scan. And we might not figure out for a long time other than the fact that the ammeter is showing slightly negative that we've lost the alternator. But in the G1000, if the alternator goes offline, probably within 1 to 2 minutes, the battery voltage will have drooped to 24 volts, and then it's going to get really noisy in the airplane as the chime goes on and off continuously.
As the chime, or we get a tag on the screen, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So, and this is where perfect scenario here. If I say, all right, so how are we going to know if you had an alternator failure? And then you'll say, a tag's going to pop up. And I'll say, all right, well, now what are you going to do? So what's a good savvy instrument applicant do from here, Max?
Follow the checklist.
Yeah, dig the checklist out. Don't try and memorize this. So you're going to say, all right, well, I'm going to grab my checklist and I'm going to go through this. This is what we'd expect you to do in real life. There's no reason not to do it on your practical test.
Good.
And literally just work through that. So then, we'll kind of play the game and you're going to say, well, is it VFR or IFR? And the mean examiner is going to say, well, of course, it's 300 overcast for the next 70 miles. So we're going to have to handle this in instrument conditions, Max. And eventually the battery is going to die, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And that's going to be a problem because if battery 1 dies, I'm now down to my battery 2, which is guaranteed to last for somewhere from, 30 to 40 minutes, something like that. And if both batteries have run all the way down, boy, I'm not going to have many instruments left other than my 3 round gauge instruments. And I'll certainly have no navigation capability other than my iPad or iPhone or my Garmin watch to navigate.
And we're hoping we don't put you into that position. So we try not to ask you cascading failures. However, if we said, alt 1 is gone and bat 1 finally drained, a really valid question will be is what's still going to be working? Can I still talk to ATC? Do I still have any navigation? Do both of my screens still work on that backup? Depending on the aircraft, we have different answers to these questions depending on the systems. What we're looking for you is to tell us what happens in your airplane.
Sure.
One of the aircraft that I regularly do check rides in is actually a G2 Cirrus that has the Avidyne R9 system. And one of the quirks is you lose the audio panel. So what's the audio panel? And I get all kinds of crazy answers from it. Well, you won't be able to talk to ATC. Well, the audio panel is just talking to each other.
And I'm going to jump in for a moment to add some additional information about audio panels. In most cases, they're not just for talking with each other in the cockpit, but they are the primary way that we route all audio signals around the cockpit. And most of the time when we use an audio panel, it's to select which radios are going to be connected to the pilot and co-pilot headsets, and that's usually comm 1 or comm 2. Though there are many other things like nav radios or even music that can be routed through the audio panel to the headsets or perhaps to the overhead speaker. And many modern audio panels also have an intercom built into them as well, and that's the portion that allows the pilot and passengers to communicate with themselves in the airplane without being heard by ATC. In older airplanes, the audio panel and the intercom could be 2 separate devices. Now, Jason was just asking about what happens if you lose power to the audio panel. Can you still talk with ATC? And the answer is that if the audio panel loses power, you're going to lose all functions. But with most modern audio panels, when you lose power, they have a fail-safe function, which causes a relay to close that connects the pilot's headset to comm 1. So for those audio panels, the answer would be if it loses power, the pilot can still talk with ATC on comm 1, but none of the other functions of the audio panel or the intercom will work.
And we might lose the FMS keypad, but we can still tune frequencies on the panels themselves. So knowing how to handle failures in the systems is really an important part of this instrument check ride. And understanding the aircraft you're bringing to the day is something the examiner is going to ask. So, Max, right. I think you're heading in the right direction here with your knowledge.
So let's see here. A G1000, we lost the alternator. Eventually, the battery dies. And this is going to vary by aircraft, as you said. But in a 172 G1000, when battery 2 is the only thing left, it's going to power the essentials bus, which is going to give me about 6 items. And if I don't remember them, just look at the circuit breakers for the essentials bus, and that's going to help you out. But it's going to leave me with the PFD, COM1, NAV1, GPS1, the air data computer, and the AHRS. So I'll have instrument indications on my PFD. It's also going to provide me with the engine gauges. And I think that's about it. If I were in a Cirrus, my autopilot would still work, but that wouldn't be the case in a Cessna product.
Very true, and you're right on the right path here. So basically what I'm looking to figure out is, all right, with what you've got in your knowledge, what's going to be your next plan? Do you still have the ability to fly a GPS approach, a VOR approach, an ILS? Can you still navigate? Can we still talk to ATC? And how are you going to handle that? One of the really big gotchas, depending on the airplanes you're using, is all of those supplements for the aircraft, right? So, if I bought myself a 1975 172, but then I modified it and threw an Aspen in and maybe threw a second battery in, and the POH for that aircraft may not necessarily be representative of exactly how that airplane is going to work. So you may have an updated circuit breaker diagram, you may have an upgraded essential or non-essential bus information piece. So make sure you know how that aircraft is going to operate, how it's actually configured. Sometimes, we've seen POHs that differ greatly from what the aircraft is actually configured as. I've seen some really nice aircraft modifications over the years, and boy, they certainly don't look like that 1968 Cherokee panel that might be in the POH. They got a brand new G600 panel in there. So, pay attention to how those systems are going to work with that, and that's the questions that we're going to be asking. As we think about modern panels, Max, you mentioned a couple of this ADHAR system. Knowing whether we have single or dual ADHARs is an important question a lot of times we'll ask.
And I guess in our 172 G1000, it's going to be single. We're not going to have a backup AHRS or backup ADC in that aircraft. We might if we were in one of the Cirrus or some other airplanes.
Certainly, and a piece of that equipment might be a question we would ask too. So we have this, the heading reference system, we have the air data computer and what feeds those, but we also might have a magnetometer, right?
Yeah, so in a 172, that's going to be way out on the right wing, I believe, and it's going to feed through the AHRS in order to get that data to the PFD. So if my AHRS has died, I've lost my compass information from the magnetometer as well.
And this is where we get to that fun perennial question on an instrument check ride of what happens if my magnetometer fails? Or in the old days, what happened if my HSI or heading indicator failed? And one of the ways I get to ask it here now is, so what would happen if that magnetometer failed? What would you see as a panel indication to let you know that had failed?
So in the G1000, we're going to see a red X on the magnetometer. And I'll ask you one. If my magnetometer failed, is that required? Could I just fly with my wet compass?
That's a good question, isn't it? And I think you'd have to go back to the POH.
That's what I would do, yeah.
Or if there wasn't anything in the POH, you're going to probably have to go back to the actual type certificate for the airplane to see if it's required. I would anticipate in most of these aircraft, it is going to be required equipment, but assuming we're in the emergency situation in the air where our magnetometer failed, maybe we wouldn't dispatch it that way. You have that big red X across your heading indicator. Max, what do you got left to tell us what direction we're going? I mean, how do we figure that out now?
Well, so we've got the little whiskey compass, the little wet compass that's out of sight, out of mind. I actually had a flight instructor ask me one time, does a G1000 have a regular wet compass in there? It's so far out of mind, people forget that it's there.
And interestingly, there's I've actually even seen a couple aircraft that don't have those anymore because they have a backup indicator like an Aspen or a G5 that is battery powered. So you are even seeing some aircraft that don't have those whiskey compasses anymore. But this is a great opportunity for the examiner, assuming you have that lovely round ball compass up on the top of the dash that's really hard to see and bounces around, to say, hey, tell me about compass turning errors and how they're going to work. And Max, I'm going to let you off the hook here. You ready?
No, go ahead.
So my favorite answer to this, and this is the most practical one, is the applicant could tell me all about the mag compass turning errors. Hopefully they can, and they could tell me they can time some turns, but they also are perfectly valid to say, my GPS is still working, and I can use the track on the GPS to give me a more accurate indication of the direction of travel of the aircraft than that little ball compass is going to give me.
Yep. Makes total sense to me. That's what I would use for real. Now, it's funny, when you ask about compass dip errors, I kind of went, oop, gulp. I hadn't thought about those in quite some time. But I still remember a long time ago, I did my instrument check ride. Wow, I think it was 30 years ago this year, in fact. And the examiner almost caught me. He said to me, and we should just explain that compass dip errors occur because essentially the wet compass is suspended, on a point, and it, can both pitch up and down and rotate freely, on that point. And there are errors that occur, especially when you're turning or when you're accelerating or decelerating. And they said to me, when you're taxiing, describe the compass dip errors. And I almost started to do that. And then I realized, no, wait, the aircraft is straight and level, which it wouldn't normally be in a turn. Therefore, there are no compass dip errors.
And there might be a little bit of lag just as, momentum changes, but it shouldn't be doing too much while we're taxiing. I like it. And this is a great spot to say, in real life and in a bad scenario, using other resources is fine too. If you do have an iPhone or an Android phone or an iPad in there, you're also going to get information off that too. And showing that you have resources available. I'm not saying that's your primary indication, but it certainly is a great backup in an instrument failure situation as well. So we're going to talk those mag compasses, another big system we like to talk about, Max, that relates into one of those digital systems. We do still have pedostatic systems on these airplanes, right?
Yes, we do.
So if I'm thinking about that pedostatic system, you told me it had to be checked prior to, inspection wise from a maintenance standpoint. What are we seeing in terms of systems or data that is, input into our digital panel that's affected by that pedostatic system?
Oh, sure. So you want to know which instruments are driven off the pedostatic. So if there's a problem with it, which ones are affected? And those are going to be my air instruments. So airspeed is connected to both of those. And then let's see, we've got altimeter and vertical speed, which are connected only to the static line. And if it were modern glass cockpit aircraft, then our outside air temperature and also our winds aloft generator come off that system as well.
This is a great way for us to kind of back into another question and say, Max, what if that pitot tube got blocked? What might be a really common cause for a blockage of a pitot tube for an IFR pilot?
Sure, it might ice over, for example, if you forget to turn on the pitot heat, or if, for example, the pitot heat isn't working for that matter.
Perfect. It's a great way for us to kind of back into those icing questions now, isn't it? So I get to ask about, hey, do we have any other anti or de-icing equipment on this airplane?
No, not on a Cessna 172. Now, I did see a 182 in which my client had added TKS panels to it, but I've never seen any kind of de-icing on a 172.
Not so much. So I might even ask the question, so could you fly into known icing conditions then?
Definitely not. And I guess a bigger question is, what constitutes known icing?
And that's a great way to back into that question, isn't it? Or even just get somebody, we start talking about weather here a little bit. How would you determine where in an instrument flight environment you might be likely to encounter some icing?
Sure. I guess I would start first with the freezing levels, and then I'd look to see if there are any clouds out there at those levels. And, a pretty good rule of thumb that we're going to pick up ice in, certainly anywhere from 0 to minus 20 degrees. But of course, to get to minus 25 or minus 30, we probably would have gone through.
Probably have gone through some of it. Either that or we're flying in International Falls and it started that way.
Yeah, exactly. So, exactly.
Max, this is a great way to kind of transition into some of that weather information. And I said this is a practical test, right? So when somebody says, well, I'd have to figure out where the freezing levels are, I'm going to make you do it.
Okay.
So you would show me. So how would you think a good applicant like yourself could show me where the freezing levels are going to be along that proposed flight that we gave you earlier?
Sure. I would probably start with aviationweather.gov, and I would click on forecasts, and I would go to the winds aloft section. And not only are there winds aloft, but they would tell me every 3,000 feet what the projected temperature is at that altitude. Or I could go to a chart that's also on that website, which uses colors to show bands of color, which would indicate the freezing level in different parts of the country.
Perfect. And there's some great resources out there now on this. In the absolute hard way, you could grab that METAR data and do some math if you wanted to figure out the temperature lapse rates, right? Another good way to do it. But yeah, that aviationweather.gov chart sequence is probably the best way for an applicant to come start figuring out where some of these icing concerns are going to be.
Yeah, and I would find all that same data in either ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot or something like that.
That's exactly. And those resources are available on the practical test. There's nothing wrong with an applicant saying, hey, let me pull out my ForeFlight, pull out my Garmin Pilot, pull out whatever application they want and say, before I go flying, this is what I'm going to use. This to me shows, an applicant's ahead of the game and knows what they're looking for and how to find it. So that kind of sequences us through some of the major IFR related systems, right? We know how to make sure whether our vacuum system's there, whether we have pedostatic, whether we have ADHARs, how our mag compasses, we get some of these failures, and we can dig into them. And certainly if you do bring an aircraft that is anti or de-icing equipped, we're going to talk about those specific systems and their limitations as well. But from there, we might start transitioning into that cross-country flight that we had you plan for a reason. So
I'm going to back you up there. I'm surprised that you didn't ask me, and I'm thinking you're being nice to me today. So stop being nice to me. You didn't ask me what's going to happen if that pitot tube freezes over and I start to climb, what kind of altitude indication I would get or airspeed.
I will absolutely ask that typically. Good point. I probably wouldn't let you off the hook. I'm going to ask, what if it did get blocked over? What are you going to do? And your first answer is probably, well, turn the pitot heat on. But I am going to ask, what systems are going to be affected? And do you have a backup for it? And very rarely do we have a backup for the pitot tube, right? So
correct.
But a lot of times there is an alternate static source. We might ask you about what happens if I have to use the alt static.
Sure. And then the way I always like to think about these is if I'm thinking about airspeed, then the way airspeed is created is by the difference between the higher pressure in the pitot tube and the lower pressure in the static. And so essentially if the pitot is now sealed off, then the only thing that's going to change is my static pressure. So as I climb, that static input is going to get lower and lower, which is going to be a bigger difference between the pitot pressure, which is now trapped. And so as I climb, it's actually going to show an increase in airspeed, which is not what we would expect.
Perfect. And an interesting question that I've run into in some cases is we might do a walk around on the aircraft later. And as we're walking around, we come back to these systems a little bit. And I notice that there's a static port on both sides of the airplane. And the question of why is, so if you've got that on your aircraft, in some cases, both of them are used into the air data computer. They compare against each other. In a few cases, when they're add-ons or modifications to the airplane, one might be for the primary flight display and one might actually be for the autopilot. So knowing which one is which and whether they're really a backup for each other is an interesting question that really is throwing some applicants for a loop when they go, I don't know. I just assume one was backup for the other. And trying to figure that out is a good question to dig on.
I guess a related question that I heard someone was asked was they pointed to the ADF antenna, that long wire that went from the wing to the top of the tail, and they were asked...
You mean the ice collector?
That's right. They were asked, how does this contribute to the structural integrity of the aircraft?
Oh, that's a great question.
The answer is not at all. It's an antenna.
All, right? Yeah. So, it's worth noting if you do have an ADF in your aircraft and it's functional, those are still optionally asked on practical tests. I actually did one within the last year on a CFII practical test. It was an aircraft that had 2 VORs, no DME, and we had to scrounge for which approaches we could do, and one of them ended up being an actual NDB approach. So, if you've got it in there, might be something that you want to make sure you're paying attention to also.
Be prepared to use it.
Be prepared to use it. So, or make sure your mechanic has disabled it prior to the practical test, which is what usually happens to us. So when we transition here, kind of, we've basically built some basics, and now we're digging into the scenario. And Max, let's pick somewhere a little bit more familiar for most people. I don't know, where do we want to have them fly? Maybe we pick something a little more logical than the middle of North Dakota for the moment. So,
well, you pick it. Something back east. Go ahead.
Maybe we imagine they're doing a cross-country flight from somewhere outside of Atlanta. We'll keep it a nice big area. They're not at primary Atlanta airport, but maybe they're Peachtree to DeKalb or something like that. And we've got them planned on a cross-country over to Memphis. So what kind of things do you think we might be looking to try and determine if you're going to plan that cross-country?
Well, let's see. I would be looking probably at what some of the preferred routes are, if they happen to exist between those, and whether or not there are any airways that connect those particular two, and then what type of minimum altitudes I might use along that airway. So I'd be looking at low altitude and route charts to look at the MEAs. If I was off airway for a lot of times, I might look for the OROCAs, the off-route obstruction clearance altitudes, kind of as an idea for minimum altitudes. And then what else? I'd certainly be looking to route myself hopefully around any TFRs or any restricted areas. Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking of. Is there something I'm missing?
I think you're headed right on the perfect track here. So, if we want to try and figure out where preferred routes are, what are some of the ways you could determine if there's preferred routing across a flight like that?
Good question. So if we happen to have the chart supplement, which is the Green Book, the new name for the Airport Facility Directory, we might have some tower and routes listed in that, but this is a little too far, I think, for tower and routes. For sure, if we went into something like ForeFlight, they're going to have under the flight plan section, when we're doing our briefing, we can come up with suggested routes that people have used in the past. And if I were doing that, I'd look at what altitudes they were using, because some of those might be for turboprops that wouldn't be appropriate for my 172 G1000. And those are the ones I can think of. Are there others?
Those are the greatest spots that I've got for it. Max, I actually kind of picked this route for a reason. I know we're kind of throwing it out there, but I do have a resource up in front of me. I've got my ForeFlight running. And,
okay.
We'll imagine we're doing this in, an SR-22 for today. So we kind of know the speeds and what that's going to do approximately. It's about a 290-mile flight. So, typically the examiner is going to give you something that is not, it's not outside the range of the fuel of the airplane. We try and get you somewhere about half a fuel tank. Why do you think maybe we're doing that?
I'm not really sure. Is it to see if I'm going to remember to switch fuel tanks?
The game here is what we're trying to do is also get you to start thinking about alternate minimums and fuel requirements. And, if we've got some rerouting, what kind of effects that's going to have on that flight as well. And a lot of times we're going to pick somewhere that has some routing considerations. Like I picked Atlanta here to Memphis. There's a really good chance that I'd be asking you about departure procedures and arrival procedures as we get into Memphis there, and how we would sequence our way into those when we consider our planning as well. You mentioned those minimum altitudes, that MEA or a MOCA, the minimum en route altitude or minimum obstacle clearance. We might even give you some scenarios, and a lot of times they happen naturally. If we look at, the temperature, maybe it's 50 degrees on the ground in Atlanta, and you say I'm going to fly at 7,000 feet. Well, I might have to think about icing, or what if I need to get myself to a lower altitude to deal with some weather issues along that way. And then we start to think about those arrival procedures as we get in there, and I'm going to ask you about them. So, maybe we'll give you a scenario, and Memphis has assigned you a specific arrival, and you're going to use that. So, how do you find the resource for that to help me transition into whatever approach we're going to be using in that Memphis area?
Sure. Okay. So since you have your electronic flight bag open in front of you, I've gone ahead and done the same thing. And I've typed in Memphis, and now I'm looking at the various arrival procedures available to me. And gosh, it looks like there are probably about 10 of them roughly.
There are. And Max, this is exactly what you should be doing on the Checkride. Don't just answer. Take your time and go through them like you're doing right now.
Sure. So I can see that the Buzz 2 arrival comes in from the northeast by and large. This is mostly I'll call it a westerly route. Ever so slightly northwest. So let me see if I can find an arrival that comes in more from the east. So let's see, that was the Buzz 2. Here's the Barbecue 3.
Well, I'll give you one hint. So let's maybe take a look at the Lugo 3.
Lugo 3. Okay, got it.
So anybody following along at home on this, they should be grabbing their iPad and looking at this too, right? We're going from PDK to KMEM, Mike Echo Mike, Memphis. And Max is now trying to figure out what happens if ATC says, hey, you're going to get the Lugo 3 arrival from the Tupelo transition, Max.
Cool. All right. So usually we've got multiple transitions. In this particular case, it looks like just one transition. No, two transitions. We got the Choo-Choo transition, which is a cute name, and we got the Tupelo transition, which comes in from over the OTB VOR, which is down to the south. So it looks like in this particular case, I'd be required to cross Tupelo at 4,000, and I'm looking ahead to see if I have any speed restrictions. And guess what? As I get to Lugo, I'm supposed to be at 230 knots. So
we know we're probably not doing that in the Cirrus, but it's also not abnormal for ATC to have you still use the same arrivals in a lesser equipped aircraft, we'll call it, than an airline might be.
Sure, but I would need to notify them that I'm unable to maintain some aspect of the arrival, which in this particular case would be the speed. And I've had that happen in the Cirrus Vision.
Excellent point.
Cirrus Vision jet. They want us to do 280. Guess what? That's above our VNE. So sometimes they'll leave us on. Sometimes they'll stick us on a different arrival.
Perfect. And you're headed in the right direction here. This is exactly what we're looking to do. And notes as we think about these arrival or departure procedures are really important. So take the time on a check ride to go through them, read these notes, try and figure out, what are the things. And I like that point that you made is, hey, look, there's a piece of this that I can't do. So if ATC assigns it, I'm going to have to tell them, hey, just a heads up, I'll be doing 160 knots. That's what I got. If it doesn't work, let me know. And sometimes they'll even assign the arrivals. There may be minimum altitudes that you can't meet. If we look at this particular plate, that MASH intersection that's in there, you've got a 16,000, you're supposed to be below and above 14. Well, they might even assign it at 6,000 if we're headed westbound and give it to us just for the sequencing effect. So, Max, if we look at this and say, look, we're flying that approach, or the arrival procedure, if we're thinking about, what's going to happen next, we're going to get transitioned into an approach. And this is a great opportunity for the applicant to say, based on today, and I'm just going to tell folks right now, they're calling winds 360 at 20, gust 25. So a little bit gusty, but it is an actual IFR day down there. It's broken 800, overcast 2100 with 2 miles viz. This is a perfect IFR day, isn't it?
Perfect. Well, let's see. So the winds are 360.
So how would we figure out what approach maybe we should be thinking about here, Max?
Okay. Well, I was first backing up to my arrival route because it's going to split at some point for whether we're landing north or whether we're landing south. So I kind of expect then that I'll get the northerly split. So that's one thing I'm going to anticipate. So, when I set that arrival up, I can know which portion of the approach to load. But if the winds are 360, then it sounds like I need to go back to airports, and now I'm going to go into my approaches tab, and I'm going to be looking for approaches that take me to the 36s, and I've got ILSs 36 left, right, and center, because this is Memphis, and they have a lot of traffic, especially at night when FedEx is coming in there at the same time. So I could consider one of those ILS approaches, and what else do we have?
So let's go ahead and pick one of those, Max. This is a great question we'd like to start with, as we'll even look through the approach list and say, which of these approaches can you fly with the aircraft and systems you have? If we look through those approaches, we kind of know we're probably going to be able to do an ILS, but, if we're looking at a place like Memphis, we find something kind of interesting. We got a whole bunch of RNAV approaches, right?
Sure.
So if I look down the list, maybe if I go to the RNAV 1.8s in there, we're going to find an RNAV RNP X-ray runway 18 right. And this is a great opportunity for me to say, hey, why don't you go ahead and pull that RNP X-ray runway 18 right up. And I'll start with the question, can we do this?
Depends on our aircraft. And on a Cessna 172, even with a G1000, the answer would be no, because it doesn't say GPS in the parentheses. We're not capable of flying this approach.
And this is a great way for you to start getting right on the right track here. Know what approaches you can do. The notes are going to be really important, and the equipment in your aircraft is going to drive that. For most light GA aircraft, matter of fact, I'm not aware of any, an RNP-based approach is probably going to be a no-go. These are things airlines and some of the more capable biz jets are going to be doing. It's required navigation performance. So we might just say, hey, look, we're not doing that, but I take people down the rabbit hole all the time. And if I say, well, what if ATC said, try that RNP, X-ray runway 18, the applicant, all they have to do is say, well, I can't do that, but I could probably accept the RNAV GPS Zulu 18, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a way we can dive into one of the types of approaches many of the GA aircraft can do. And we're going to dig into this and try and figure out, all right, so how are we going to do this? Where would I be likely to be vectored to? Which approach minimums apply to me? In this case, for those following along at home on the RNAV GPS Zulu runway 18 right at Memphis, there's multiple approach minimums. We've got an LPV, we've got LNAV VNAV, we got an LNAV MDA, and we have those circling minimums. Max, back to that 172 G1000, which one of those minimums do you think is going to apply to us?
It's a great question. So if it's a G1000 that was built in 2007 or later, then it's got WAS, and then we could use the LPV minimums. If it's an early G1000, highly unlikely that it's got WAS in it, in which case we'd have to be looking at the LNAV minimums.
Perfect. And this is important for us to be able to determine which minimums are going to apply to us. A confusing point for a lot of folks is that LNAV, VNAV, DA. For most of the aircraft, it's a Baro VNAV compensating system in which you're going to actually be selecting a local altimeter setting. It is not the same as WAS. So if you have WAS on your aircraft, the LPV minimums are typically going to apply. If you don't, the LNAV minimums are typically going to apply, unless you specifically know your aircraft has that Baro VNAV sensing system where you're going to be putting an altimeter setting in, then that LNAV VNAV may be applicable. This is not to be confused, but regularly is on an instrument check ride with an LNAV approach that gives you a plus V, a recommended vertical glide path. And it is still a non-precision approach for you, although it certainly helps you establish that approach and keep it stabilized.
Sure. Yeah, and the LNAV/VNAV approaches could be flown with a WAS-capable GPS, but you would almost never do it because the minimums are always lower with an LPV, and the satellite signal requirements are the same for an LPV and an LNAV/VNAV, which means if we have a poor satellite signal, we're going to downgrade all the way down to LNAV. We'll never be downgraded to LNAV/VNAV.
Fantastic point. I like that. So, but you said that the winds weren't going to give us that 1A, right? So maybe we're going to take a look instead. And this is why a lot of times we'll pick an airport with multiple approaches. So right now we've already had two of them we talked about here at this airport. We talked about the RMP. We've talked about an actual GPS that we can fly. Max, you said we might be getting an ILS. Let's imagine we're coming from that west and they're going to keep us on the right side. We have an ILS 36 right. At some point during an instrument check ride, I'm going to ask, all right, so here we are. We have this ILS 36 right. Give me a briefing on how you're going to do this. And Max, what would you do in that case? I mean, how would you start to brief an approach like this?
Sure. Well, first of all, I make sure I don't have the ILS 36 right Cat 2 or Cat 3 because we won't be able to use that chart and fly that
perfect
without the airplane or without training for it. But I would typically start in the upper right-hand corner, and I'm always looking to see is GPS in the title, and if it's not, then it kind of tells me I need to do something different. This is ILS or localizer, so I know that I'm going to have my nav radio tuned to the ILS, and then I'm usually looking in the upper right to see, is there a runway number, which tells me that it's a straight-in approach. If it's an Alpha or a Bravo instead, it tells me that most likely we're coming in at an angle, and so it's going to be called a circling approach, and so we're not going to have straight-in minimums. If we were out in the very high mountains out west here, we might get an Alpha or a Bravo. Also, if our MDAs were so high, like 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet above the runway, that we wouldn't be able to do a normal descent from the missed approach point down to the runway. Then after that, I'd look to the upper left, and I would see what frequency we need for the ILS, 111.35. I'd look at our final approach course, 360. And if I had for example, an older CDI, I would be dialing in the 360 just as a kind of memory aid that my final approach course is going to be 360. I would look through my notes in my missed approach because I'd want to memorize the first couple of steps of the missed approach. By the way, as I'm looking at the notes, I see both a T in a triangle and an A in a triangle. So that tells me that I've got non-standard alternate minimums and non-standard takeoff minimums at this airport. And then I'd work through my frequency box down below that from left to right, all the different frequencies I need to dial in. And then I would get down to the main portion of the map, and I'd start trying to figure out, am I starting at an IAF somewhere? And if so, what is it? Or do I think I'm going to get vectored to this approach? And then from there, I'd probably work my way down to the minimums, figure out what kind of minimums do we have on this approach. And since it's an ILS, I'll probably want to look at the lowest minimums I could use, which in this case would be 535 feet. But I'd also be looking at what category that I'll be flying the approach in. If I'm in a Cessna 172, I'm at 90 knots, which means if I stay at 90 knots, I'm just barely in category A. But in this particular case, if I get slightly fast, the minimums are the same for category B. So I'd plan to descend to 535 feet, and I darn well better have 1,800-foot RVR minimums when I'm ready to land at this airport.
A couple points that I like to, keep people in mind. These notes on these charts are really important, right? If we look up towards the top for folks following along, it says DME or radar required, right? So do we have DME on the airplane?
We don't, but fortunately an IFR-capable GPS is a substitute for a DME.
Great point. And then we also look down below, and if we imagine we're flying an airplane that had DME, I might ask the question of, well, where's the DME coming from? Is it coming from the Memphis VOR, or is it coming from the localizer?
Yeah, if I look at the profile view, which shows the sloping glide path coming down from right to left, and I see the DME distances, I see right above 1.7 miles at the threshold of the runway I-MYO, so that tells me the DME in this case is coming off of the localizer.
And that's an important point. You might find your examiner pulls up an approach plate that has a VOR on the field. The DME is coming from the VOR, or you might be coming from the ILS in this case. Another unique piece for this, and we're starting to see this on more, is they have what's called an alternate missed approach fix, right? So, I might ask the question, well, what would you do in the missed approach for this? Or what would you do if the ATC assignment was to fly the alternate missed approach?
Sure. So alternate missed approaches are great because they keep me from having to go all the way out to the hold and kind of speed me up if I want to come back around and shoot another approach. So in this particular case, they show that there is a hold at La Rue for the alternate missed, and they would probably give me some kinds of instructions such as, on the missed, turn right to heading of, 090, climb and maintain 3,000. And then from there, they might give me radar vectors to this alternate missed.
And what's interesting is in some of the cases, the alternate missed is for different equipage of the aircraft. The alternate missed might be in the event that a VOR is out of service. There's an alternate one. We're finding this in a lot of cases as some of the VORs are decommissioned or less reliable. It may be the case for that reason as well. Something to kind of pay attention to.
Interesting. Makes total sense. Yeah, we lost one of our VORs around here recently.
So Max, I'm gonna kind of change the game here a little bit, and this is where the examiner gets to typically have some fun, and I want to point out why approach notes are so important. Let's look at something a little bit closer to you, and maybe another approach here at Monterey, Mike Romeo Yankee. They've got an ILS localizer runway 10 right at Mike Romeo Yankee, Monterey, California.
Okay, I am there.
So I'm not going to make an applicant brief every approach again. So they've showed me they can brief an approach, but then I'm going to start asking some specific questions. Like, if we take a look at this one, the approach minimums for an ILS get you down to how high above the ground?
Typically 200 feet AGL.
So, and in this case, it does exactly that, right? But man, the winds are they typically out of the east there in California for you?
So typically the winds would favor this approach early in the morning or maybe late at night. The vast majority of the time of the day, the winds would favor the opposite direction.
So, might there be a reason they would fly this approach instead of something that approaches from the east there in Monterey, do you think? We
Sure.
look at this chart and there's a big chunk of brown stuff out there the other side. So It's not abnormal for sometimes approaches to be used that are going to generate a need to circle, right? So if we actually look at the same airport at Monterey, they do have a localizer that approaches from the other side. It gets you all the way down to 1,603 feet above the ground. Boy, that's not going to help you on an IFR day too much. But if you look at the circling minimums for this one, they get you down to 663 feet above the ground, right?
Yeah, and so that would certainly be good enough on some days to get me down below the clouds and get me into the airport.
So then the question becomes, all right, so if I shoot this ILS 10 right, how am I going to enter the traffic pattern? How am I going to do that circle to land on the opposite side, to land on 28 left in this case? Probably.
Well, if it were me, I would just pull the parachute. I don't know what you'd do in a 172.
I'm thinking we might want to use the airplane again. So how about we figure out a way to go ahead and land this, Max? And this is where the notes start to get critical.
Exactly.
I'm giving you a hint I wouldn't necessarily give an applicant, especially not a double I applicant. But what's something that they're going to need to know here?
Yeah, and you didn't have to give me the hint because I fly into this airport regularly. It says right there on the top of the notes, circling NA south of runway 10R 28 left, because if you were to go to the right at all, man, you're into some nasty terrain. So obviously you would circle to the north side of the runway to get all turned around to land on the 28s.
And these are great ways to get an applicant to start looking at those minimums. And not for nothing, one of the things we're looking for is, are you going to find the things on an approach plate that's going to let you fly the approach safely without ending up bumping into big, hard, grumpy things called mountains? We want to make sure you're going to be a good, safe pilot out there. And the ability to interpret these plates properly, take the time, read them, and then transition that and correlate that information to how you're actually going to fly it is really a big part of our questioning that we're going to do on approach plates. Certainly many examiners will also ask a couple of other types of approaches as well. We're not going to forget those old school VOR approaches. And we're going to probably ask you some things like back courses, maybe ask you a little bit about a localizer only approach, how those things change compared to an ILS, and try and get you to approach, the plates in a way that will help you determine, can you use them for your aircraft, when do they apply, and which notes are going to make it either a doable or not doable approach for you. And if they are doable, do they modify how you're going to actually get to that airport? Max, is that making sense for what we're looking for on the approach plate interpretation portion of this Checkride?
Sure, absolutely. Now, would you be asking me at some point about alternate takeoff minimums and alternate minimums and stuff like that?
I absolutely will be. And this is part of that scenario. So, we started with Memphis and we kind of dove into approach plates, but I might say, we were looking at Memphis there, Max, and I think we looked back a little bit ago here to that weather, and it wasn't exactly reporting the greatest on the METAR. It was that 800 overcast kind of stuff. We got a 290-mile flight, I said. So, if we're leaving Peachtree to Calb and we're going to head to Memphis, it's going to take us, let's imagine, 2 hours. How are we going to know if we need to have an alternate airport? And then, if so, what could we use as an alternate?
Sure. So now you're talking about what I would call the 1-2-3 rule, which means I'm going to look at my destination Memphis at the time of arrival, and the one is going to be plus and minus 1 hour of my arrival. I need to see if the ceiling is going to be at least 2,000 feet and the visibility at least 3 mile visibility. That's my 1-2-3. And if I don't meet that, then I need an alternate.
So, Max, one of the questions I think is interesting that a lot of times I get a quizzical look is, what can you use to determine whether the weather meets that requirement? Does my METAR tell me that?
So I said that it's going to be plus and minus an hour of the forecast. So we're going to have to look at the TAF to determine that, because the METAR is just going to give us 1 point in time. So I think the TAF is going to govern.
In most cases, you're absolutely correct. But what if I'm going to an airport that doesn't have a TAF?
In that case, I can look at the graphical area forecast?
That's exactly it. We even kind of look at the question of a lot of folks will tell me the nearest TAF, and I might pick somewhere that's 40 or 50 miles from a nearest TAF. And then they kind of go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. We get used to having TAFs in many places we go fairly nearby. Even if it's 7, 8, 10 miles, we know they're pretty reliable. But technically, that graphical forecast is really what we should be using outside of a TAF area. Another good resource in general, while, not mandatory, is also that forecast discussion. You'll find those in a lot of the aviation weather forecasts. You can kind of read a little bit deeper and find a little bit more about what the weather is going to do in the area. A good resource for an instrument applicant also to reference. So if we need an alternate, Max, we also have to figure out, can we get there? How do we know from a fuel requirement, from a planning perspective, are we going to be able to make it to an alternate that meets our requirement?
Let's see. So I need to have enough fuel to get to my destination airport, and then fly from there to my alternate, and then still have enough fuel to continue flying for another 45 minutes at kind of a cruise kind of power setting.
And that's a really kind of a tough thing sometimes to meet, isn't it? I'm imagining you personally have ended up in situations where you had shorter first legs on your flights because you couldn't make an alternate in real life. Is that the case?
Yeah, on occasion, but mostly I fly on nice days.
Lucky devil. We run into this in downwind of the Great Lakes a lot of times, where you'll have large areas that are 400 or 500 overcast, and sometimes you have to try and find an alternate, and in a very few cases you might not even find one that's within your range. So what we're looking for is somebody on a practical test then to apply that and back up. And it might be, if we had a flight from here to Memphis, that we needed a fuel stop because we needed to stay within alternate minimums as well. Kind of see how that scenario starts to play out on your practical test here?
Yep.
So related to that, we've got our planning, you've got those alternate minimums. We're kind of backing into weather information here, aren't we?
Sure enough.
So what kind of things would a good savvy instrument pilot be looking for to get a briefing, and the applicant is going to be able to show the examiner, me in this case, that they can make a good decision about how or whether they're going to be able to make that flight happen?
Well, I think I'm going to probably need all weather information that's pertinent to the flight, which is pretty broad set of things. So we could, for example, contact flight service, call them up on the 800 number and get a full briefing from them. I think these days most people probably get their briefings electronically. If you've got ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, then you're probably putting in your flight plan and hitting the briefing button and getting back just a ton of information. But yeah, you're going to want to take a look at all that and figure out where are the frontal areas. Do you have a cold front headed toward your destination, which could make things, rather dicey. Where are the highs and lows on the charts? Are you flying toward good weather, toward bad weather? Where is the precipitation currently? Is there any convective sigmets? Do we expect any lightning to be occurring? Where are the sigmets in general? Do we have any areas for turbulence or for icing or for IFR and mountain obscuration? Are there any other really extreme, sigmets like volcanic ash? Fortunately, we don't have to worry about that too much here in the lower 48, though you could worry about that up in Alaska, or I suppose even in Hawaii. And then we'll start drilling down to our forecast, both for our departure airport and for our destination. Also looking at freezing levels, which we talked about earlier. If I were flying into known icing and I had a Fiki-capable aircraft, I'd want to know what the cloud tops were, because my plan would be to get on top of the clouds so that I wouldn't stay in icing conditions the whole way. So I might be looking at the infrared satellite charts, for example, to see what color the clouds are and correlate that to a temperature and a height of the clouds to see if I can get on top of them. So those are some of the things I'd be looking at.
And this is, I think, where the applicant gets the opportunity to show that they can sift through information that's pertinent or non-pertinent, and apply some of that information. One of the questions we might ask also is, how do you determine where that icing is going to be based on the information you got? What the weather might be at your time of arrival versus, what if you left a few hours later? And this is where strategic versus tactical decision-making starts to come into play. And we can see if the applicant can then correlate that weather information back to the scenarios we gave them. If you can do that, as it seems you're starting to do here for me, that's a really good point on the Checkride. So
yeah, and so things I would also look at now that you mention it would be the SIP, the current icing product, and as well as the forecasted icing probability. Those are really handy for getting a good idea, not only where the forecasted icing is, but also where the SLDs are, the super liquid cooled droplets, which can be severe ice.
And certainly hoping we're not heading into any of those.
No.
One of the pieces I think that's really kind of critical here is to show that you can piece this together in a full framework. So right now, we've kind of talked about a few different things here, but as we look at the scenario, we're starting to try and figure out, you can plan across country, you can figure out the weather, you can apply those approach plates. We know what happens if the systems are working properly, what we're going to do if they don't. And this is starting to show whether we have a well-rounded instrument applicant or not. I think, that's really kind of a viewpoint that most examiners are looking for here to see, are they going to have good decision-making skills and the ability to bring all of those pieces together from just memorization level learning to an actual applicable instrument flight.
Good.
I want to add a piece here. What about NOTAMs?
NOTAMs, well, in fact, we've got one right here for the ILS 36 right at Memphis International. So I would always read the NOTAMs because they will often tell us, for example, things like whether we've got different minimums on the chart. That's real common at our approaches here in Palo Alto because we have so much construction going on. So the construction cranes. So our minimums are higher than they usually are. In fact, we've recently been NOTAM not available at night. So a lot of stuff is going on there. In this particular case, it looks like, what does this one say? 100% wet observed. So I guess the runway is wet currly. I
guess they actually put a NOTAM out for relating to, baby braking action or stoppage there, right?
And that's going to be important if we've got a big heavy aircraft and need to know whether or not we'll be able to stop in time. And certainly for high performance aircraft, we have all kinds of charts available, and we can actually put in, how wet the runway is and what kind of braking we would expect. And that's going to generate longer landing requirements than if it's a dry runway.
I want to add one piece here, and we're kind of covering a high level approach to this, but one tidbit I always really tell people is make sure you look at approach plates for your instrument check ride, not just at the local airports where you fly. And this is a lot easier for us as examiners now that we have electronic flight bags. It's not uncommon for me to just zoom in somewhere in the country and grab some approaches and say, look, if you flew there today, what approaches would they be? And I think you really do yourself a disservice as an applicant if you only look at the 10 or 15 approaches maybe at the 5 local airports that you've flown. Learn to fly those, learn to actually interpret the approaches as if you were going to fly them. And don't be afraid to look around the country a little bit. If you're sitting there watching TV at night, zoom in somewhere in the country, pick some approach plates and just go, wow, what's this? And you might find some cool stuff sometimes too.
Yeah, charts are fun, especially the funky names they use on them sometimes.
When we got the Memphis, we didn't pick the Arrival, but the barbecue Arrival looks like it'd be kind of cool. And I think they actually have spicy barbecue ribs as some of the approaches coming down into Kansas City. And I know there's one out east that's I taught, putty, I tat, and a good homage back to the cartoon days. So you'll find some cool stuff if you really take the time to look at them. And while you're doing it, you'll actually get better at interpreting approach plates.
Yeah, indeed. We've got one in Santa Rosa, which is named for all the Peanuts characters, Snoopy and Charlie Brown and Linus, because Charles Schultz that was his hometown, was Santa Rosa. He was the cartoonist who created Peanuts.
So, Max, this is kind of the overview of the ground portion. I know we've been going here for about an hour or so. I want to just kind of mention the flight portion, right?
Sure.
So the flight portion of your practical test, you're not going to actually fly the cross country. That was the academic side where the examiner gets to check and see how you're doing and how you would plan. We're actually going to fly the flight portion of an instrument check ride locally as best we can to get some approaches done. And we really have a sequence of things that we have to accomplish. We have to do a precision approach, we have to do a non-precision approach, and we have to do a missed approach to a hold, we have to do a circling, and we have to do an approach with a loss of primary flight instrument indicators. So that really tells you what we're going to have to do in terms of 3 approaches with a hold and a missed, and we have some unusual attitude recovery, and that's going to be your sequence. Now, here's a secret point. Everybody says, well, which approaches is the examiner going to do on the day of my test? I will tell you, in most cases, it's sequenced based on which direction the winds are blowing and which approaches the ATC is going to let you get that day. So, if I have a westerly wind, I'm going to probably be shooting approaches that approach from the east towards the west. If I have an easterly wind, I'm going to probably have to shoot approaches from the opposite direction, north, south, same way. So if you're thinking about your upcoming check ride, prevailing winds is probably going to help you pick some of the approaches. And in most cases, the examiner is not going to have you fly 200 miles away. They're going to pick local airports. So for a savvy applicant prepping their check ride, they might start looking at approaches, maybe within a 50-mile radius at the most, but is also going to need to be able to get those special approaches in. So it might be a precision-like approach. So they could do an LPV. We have some stipulations for that, since there is an actual glide path, as long as it gets you down below 300 feet or so above the ground. Many cases, you're going to be doing an ILS. If there's a VOR nearby, you could probably expect to have one of those. And if you have a GPS in the aircraft, you can probably expect to get a GPS. So we do have to do one of them as a full approach, which means either a T-bar GPS, or we have something with a full course reversal, a procedure turn, or a hold to get you onto an approach. And the rest could technically be vectored. Good questions people ask. Can I use my autopilot? Well, most examiners will tell you yes. Matter of fact, I would kind of like to see you use it. I assume you're going to use it in real life. So we're going to probably have you use it on at least one of the approaches on your practical test. Now, you should also expect to fly at least one of them by hand so we can see you can physically fly an approach. Maybe a good systems failure we would use as an example on a test is to say, hey, I see your autopilot breaker popped and it's in up. Let's fly this one by hand. So tidbit though, if the examiner hasn't said it's broken, assume all resources are still available to you. Max, is this kind of what you were expecting you might find on the flight portion of a check ride?
Well, I'm hoping that I didn't say anything that's going to cause the FAA to take away my instrument rating. Am I in good shape so far?
I think you're in good shape so far. You seem to be making good decisions and headed in the right direction.
Hey, let me ask you about one of my favorite topics, which is lost communication. So let's say that I have taken off and I am up there at, pick an altitude, 13,000 feet, and I've lost communication. I'm going to turn this around, and I'm going to ask you as the applicant, what are you going to do when you're at 13,000 feet and you lose communication?
Well, my first question is, am I IFR or VFR?
Ooh, excellent. Well, let's make it easy for you first and then hard for you later. You're VFR, sir. Or rather, you're in VMC. You're IFR, but you're in VMC.
Yeah, I'm VMC, right? So the best question is if I can make a safe transition VMC to a place of landing, I'm going to go land at that safe place. I'm going to give flight service a call and tell them what happened. And I'm going to go ahead and move on with fixing my airplane, right?
Good job. You got that airplane out of the system quickly. That's good.
If I'm IFR, we have this lost comm scenario, and I actually asked this on pretty much every check ride. So, the scenario is, what if we've lost comms? What altitude do I maintain? And one of the really big gotcha points there is, so if I'm at 6,000 feet and I'm cleared and I lose my comms, well, first thing I'm going to try is maybe try another frequency. A good opportunity here is to jump onto that low en route chart, see if there's a center frequency. And sometimes we just run out of the frequency range, right? Maybe try somebody else. But if I don't get anybody else, I'm going to proceed to my airport. And if I'm there early, I'm going to have to hold. I get that answer all the time. But then I say, well, what altitude are you going to hold at? And one of the questions that we're trying to get there is the understanding of what your clearance limit is at that point. So if I'm cleared at 6,000, I get there early, and the hold's at 3,000, the expectation from ATC is that I'm going to hold at 6,000 until my further clearance expectation, at which point then I could drop down to my 3,000 and fly an approach, right?
Okay.
Does that scenario make sense? Is that what you were kind of looking for?
No, absolutely. So let's see what else. How about our altitudes? We're told that for every segment, we've got to be at the highest of the assigned altitude, the MEA, or the expected altitude. Now, suppose I'm on a couple of different airways as I'm trying to get to my destination. I'm still in the clouds. I've lost communication. Does that assigned altitude apply once I get on the second or third airway, or does that really only apply for the segment that I'm on?
That's a good question. It would depend on if there's a climbing altitude required for the segment. So, imagine I'm flying in a mountainous area and I was assigned 4,000, but I'm flying down by Nashville maybe, and I know I'm going to have to get up to 8,000 to get above some mountains. I would fly the highest of the altitudes that's going to keep me safe, whether that's the assigned altitude or, whether we've been vectored on something, or if we have something that is going to keep us along an airway, perhaps, that we've filed to keep us safe along that route. If we're off airway, it would be the off-route obstacle clearance altitude, that OROCA.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked earlier about clearance limits. Now, most of the time, isn't our airport our clearance limit?
In most cases, it is, and this is where it gets a little bit vague, and we might ask the question, if we're here looking at this Memphis scenario again, if we lost our comms, we would have to kind of figure out, you're cleared to Memphis, but if we lost comms, we're not really cleared to a specific point, especially if we're just doing GPS direct. So the best case in a scenario like that is to figure out which approach might be most likely that we're going to use, pick an initial approach fix on that at our cleared altitude, and establish a hold there until we're ready to fly it in, right?
Okay. And let's say my clearance limit is Memphis, and I filed my flight plan and said it'd take me 2 hours to get to Memphis. But I've had nice tailwinds, and I've arrived an hour and 40 minutes. Do I have to wait somewhere for 20 minutes?
You absolutely have to wait until that clearance limit. And this is a great point. You might be sitting in that hold for a while. It does get easier if we're picking an approach that has a depicted hold already on it. Some of the approaches we might choose have a hold at the initial approach fix, and we would hold at that highest of those altitudes. But yeah, we're going to have to hold, whether it's 30, 40 minutes. If we got that rare eastbound tailwind for us, we're going to have to hang out and wait until we fly that approach, because that's what ATC is expecting us to do. And this is where some of those base skills that a lot of times we forget about of timing our flights do come back into play in the event of an emergency. And it's why they're important that we still maintain those skills.
It's a really good point. I don't see too many people who note their takeoff time when they're flying IFR.
Very few. And the only good part is many of our aircraft do it for us now.
Exactly. Yeah, some of the transponders will note what your flight time is. Well, sir, you're going to let me keep my IFR ticket?
I think we should probably let you fly IFR, maybe even teach a few people when you get a chance. Come on out this way. I'd love to fly with you sometime, and maybe we can poke at each other's brains a little bit and see if we can come up with a really cool flight.
Well, I'm just really lucky it's snowing out there in Michigan today, because that's why you're on the ground and why you had time to talk to me today.
It's a fantastic way to do it. And, a little time on the ground lets me come up with some questions for next time. Maybe some of these we'll talk about will end up on the next instrument check ride I do also.
That's great. Well, clearly we'll have to get together with you again soon before the winter is over.
I appreciate it, and I have a feeling we have plenty of time before winter's over for us.
Could be a long winter. Well, where do folks go to find out more about your writing and your work as a DPE?
The easiest spot to find me is actually jasonblair.net. So really simple, jasonblair.net. And actually all of the things I've written are up there either under my blog or in the articles section. I would encourage folks who do have practical tests. I've done a few of these podcasts with you and some with Sporties and AOPA. Research everything you can before practical tests, whether it's an instrument one or others. And many of the other DPEs in the country are equally active when writing. And I would encourage you to Google your examiner. I always start saying I can answer any questions before we start asking them, and most examiners will do the same. Many examiners have written and talked about things that they commonly see. Do your homework ahead, and I promise your check ride is going to probably get easier.
That's awesome. Well, Jason, thanks so much for being with us to help us pass our check ride today.
My pleasure.
Well, my thanks to Jason for sharing all that information. Now, I know there are lots of questions he didn't ask me, so we'll probably have to talk about this more in a future show. By the way, if you found any value at all in this show or any of our other shows, please support us. We would love to get a small donation through our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, because we have awesome supporters. Or if you have a PayPal account, you can make a one-time or a monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And of course, when you do that, either way, we'll read your name on the show. And if you'd like to send me an email with any feedback or to record a listener question that you'd like answered on the show, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page, or click on Listener Question at the top where you can record a question. And please tell all your friends about the show, because that's how we get most of our new listeners, when people like you tell their friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, and yeah, there are a lot of people out there that don't, it's still new to them, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, because I know they know how to download an app. And just search in those stores for Aviation News Talk, download our app, and then they can listen to the show on their phone. And yeah, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.